It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. I'm Bridget Bergen, sitting in for Brian today. Across the country, a building boom is colliding with a political backlash. Annual spending on building data centers in the United States jumped from $15 billion to over $35 billion in just a few years. It's a surge driven by the AI arms race, and Americans are pushing back hard. People worry these things will drain local water, foul the air, and send their electricity bills through the roof. A Consumer Reports survey late last year found 78% of Americans somewhat or very concerned that new data centers will drive up their energy bills. Communities are turning that anxiety into action. Maybe you've come across the protests on your social media. In just the first 3 months of this year, plans for at least 20 facilities were shelved amid public opposition. That's more than $41 billion in foregone investment, according to the environmental news site Heat Map Pro. That fight has moved into state houses. At the beginning of June, the New York State Legislature passed the first-in-the-nation data center moratorium. That's awaiting Governor Kathy Hochul's signature. And at least 12 other states are weighing their own moratoria. 4 municipalities have imposed permanent bans. And in the Senate, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders has a bill to pause new AI supercomputing campuses nationwide. But our next guest argues that the conventional wisdom may have it wrong, and that these campuses can deliver real jobs and serious tax revenue. He says the truth is more complicated than the activist rhetoric suggests. Eric Levitz is a senior correspondent at Vox, where he covers the fights that divide the American left and right. Eric, welcome back to WNYC.
Thanks so much for having me.
And listeners, if you live near a data center or one that's been proposed in your town, call in and tell us exactly what happened. Has your power bill changed, the traffic, the noise, the local debate? And if your community said no, why? Would stopping a nearby center make you feel any better about AI itself? If you're involved in the AI data center battle, make your case. The number is 212-433-WNYC. That's 212-433-9692. We can also take your questions for our guest, Eric Levitz, a senior correspondent at Vox. The number one more time, 212-433-9692. Now, Eric, before we get into your argument, just set the scene for us. How big is this backlash really? You write that in just the first 3 months of this year, plans for at least 20 data centers were shelved, and that more than a dozen states are now weighing some version of a moratoria. Is this a handful of loud sort of NIMBY fights, or has opposition to data centers become a genuinely national movement?
Yeah, so I think that there's, two things happening simultaneously. One, there are individuals and groups and communities that are really actively agitating against data centers in their areas. And then, so that's, going to be a minority of the population that's really actively fighting this devoting a significant portion of their free time to trying to prevent data centers from opening in near their homes or in their general regions. But then there's a broader thing of just how the average American feels about data centers when asked by pollsters. And as you suggested, that is a really massive national bipartisan thing where, up to nearly 80% of Americans who feel that it would be a bad thing, hypothetically, if a data center were to open in their area. And so there's really widespread opposition.
Yeah, I mean, as you lay out, there's kind of a menu of fears there. There's concerns about water, air, noise, electric bills, tax giveaways, even just anxieties about AI and the future of the technology itself. Do you have a sense of which of those concerns is really driving some of the anger that you're seeing?
Yeah, well, I think that there is probably, it varies a little bit, depending on, I think that for the maybe less ideological people who are directly affected by a potential new data center project, maybe their homes are especially close to it. Maybe it is slated for land that they value for other purposes. There, I think it's really concerns are going to focus on the local potential negative effects of data centers as physical structures. I think that the degree of antipathy nationally towards data centers reflects more the anxiety and alarm and distaste for artificial intelligence as a technology, which, people are understandably concerned about where this tech is taking us. Even the people creating the technology are often disposed to muse about how what they're building could potentially threaten, human extinction or mass unemployment. And so it's pretty understandable that those who are maybe less, tech enthusiastic would be concerned about this tech and be looking for ways to frustrate its progress. And one way to do that is to deny the industry the ability to build these data centers that physically undergird their technology.
Sure. So looking at your story, the headline says data centers, quote, could actually be good for your hometown. Now, you hedge that in a lot of the piece, but let's just be clear up front. Are you saying these facilities are good or that they're not as bad as people think? And is there a difference that matters to someone living next door to one?
Yeah, so I think that my argument is that judging by the conventional standards we normally use for judging whether an industrial enterprise is desirable for a locality, that data centers can be, in the right circumstance, pretty good overall. So when we're thinking about whether a community is lucky or should, desire an industrial enterprise, our standard is not, does it contribute absolutely zero negative impacts to the local environment, because that would rule out basically almost any industrial enterprise. And we don't typically, when a town loses its auto plant or steel mill, et cetera, we don't typically say, that's so great for them. Now they won't have that air pollution. We typically recognize that we're balancing the environmental cost against the local economic benefit. And, in that framework, data centers generally, or particularly when they are in areas with a good amount of green energy resources, they're not going to emit as much pollution as a typical manufacturing enterprise. They're relatively clean in that respect. They don't use as much water as is often claimed. They don't use an exceptionally large amount of water for, a building that is performing this industrial function at such high scale. And on the flip side, they are really, the main benefit of data centers for localities is that they generate a tremendous amount of revenue. So, these buildings, they pay property taxes. They also pay taxes on the equipment that is inside of them typically. And that equipment is extremely valuable. Its market value is assessed very highly. And so you get a lot of tax revenue just from taxing servers, networking gear, generators, etc. And so for this reason, a data center can potentially generate a lot more tax revenue than, a housing complex taking up the same land. In terms of the amount of revenue per square acre you're getting a lot more. And at the same time, if you housing subdivision has new residents that are going to be paying taxes, but they're also going to be using your public schools, they're going to be driving around on your roads, using your public transit. The servers in data centers, for now, don't walk around. They stay where they are. They don't use the municipal public resources. They just pay into them.
Right.
And so this, the poster child for sort of the benefit here is Loudoun County, Virginia, where data centers now pay nearly half of the county's taxes. So basically enough to cover all government functions beyond the school system. So residents there essentially are getting their police department, their courts, their parks, their infrastructure, their maintenance, all on free, courtesy of the data centers that are located there.
Sure. Okay.
So there's more I could say, but that's the big one.
Well, let's. You did sort of send a sort of shocking additional source of anxiety, at least to me, as you talked about how the servers don't yet walk around and consume those municipal services. I think part of what I was hearing you say there is a reflection of the fact that data centers, while they may produce a lot of revenue for a municipality for their land use and some of the equipment that's being taxed, they don't necessarily generate many jobs. I also want to bring in a caller, Jim from Rockland County, who is involved in a data center fight. Jim, you're on WNYC.
Hi, good morning. I'm Jim Riley. It's town of Orangetown. It's the data bank center expansion. They want to double the size of a 100,000-foot plus data center. We have two in town already. This is on the banks of the Hackensack River, which is a major migratory pathway for hawks in the fall, for songbirds in the spring. It should never occur. It's an environmental disaster at that location, and our town already is hosting two. Plus, it may be the site of the endangered, threatened bog BOG turtle, and I do not believe that sufficient environmental screening is being done of these data centers, and there should be extensive moratoriums and pauses, including on this one.
Jim, just a quick question for you, since you are in a community with a data center, beyond the impact on the wildlife in the community, what is it like? What is the sound? Have you had any other impacts?
I'm not close to it, so I do not hear sounds and light, which does certainly come from it. There may have been a bump down in taxes, but to me, I have not perceived any significant drop in my property taxes, although there are two data centers in town. There's absolutely no employment, minimal employment, maybe some security personnel. If you look at the parking lots, there's 10, 20 cars in the parking lots at most. And I think that's mainly maintenance persons switching out computers and stuff. It is not a significant source of employment.
Sure.
And environmentally, with all due respect, they're most likely disasters, especially in a fragile pathway such as the Hackensack River Basin.
Jim, thank you for your call. Eric, just for listeners who, are still trying to wrap their heads around this emerging technology and what, in fact, a data center even is, can you explain what these facilities are? You mentioned that they contain servers that don't take municipal services, but what does a data center contain? What's the scale that we're talking about here in terms of the size of them? And, what is the argument that they don't require the kind of energy that, certainly we've heard people who are opponents of them warn that they are, potentially huge drains on certain infrastructure systems?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think one way of thinking of a data center is, as a almost giant computer, but it is, these are facilities that are, on one level, they're been with us for a long time and are pretty banal. They're what allow us to have this conversation, or at least to have it hosted online. There is no internet without data centers supporting it. At the same time, in recent years, there's been a buildup of what are called hyperscale data centers that are, as the name suggests, much larger, much more computing power. And these are dedicated primarily to supporting the incredible amount of computation that is required by these frontier large language models or modern AI. So yeah, data centers sometimes, the term can describe two different kinds of infrastructure, one that is relatively familiar, one that is a bit newer. But so that's kind of what they are. In terms of, were you asking about the energy costs, or?
Yeah, one of the issues that we've heard spoken about is that they can drive up energy costs for people who live in the communities where they're located. How would that happen, or why would that happen?
Yeah. So, and I do want to be super clear here that my ultimate thesis in my article is relatively modest, which is that there are cases in which there are some contexts in which data centers generate economic benefits, or the ratio of economic benefit to environmental harm that they generate is pretty good by traditional standards. That doesn't mean that you personally need to value those benefits over the harms, even in those cases. And certainly, if you think that AI is, going to really make the world worse, then it makes sense to oppose data centers regardless. But and then also there are going to be contexts where maybe they're net harmful. But so in those net harmful cases, I think one of the major concerns is about electricity prices, because the one economic downside of data centers is that they consume and require a tremendous amount of energy. Some of the largest ones can use about as much electricity as a mid-sized American city. And so if you imagine adding that to your local grid, there's going to be some competition there between current ratepayers and this new enterprise for energy. And if you don't have spare capacity that you can ramp up your supply to meet this new demand, then demand is going to run ahead of supply, and prices are going to go up. As I say in the piece, this doesn't happen in every case. There are some situations actually where data centers can potentially lower electricity bills. So if you have a electric grid in which people don't build electric grids to provide exactly the amount of energy that everybody in the place needs, and not a kilowatt more, or else everything gets blacked out. You have spare capacity, and some places have a lot of spare capacity, and in those places, if you have a large new industrial enterprise come in and start paying for electricity, then since a lot of the cost of providing electricity is just kind of fixed in terms of how much you need to spend maintaining power lines, maintaining power infrastructure, those costs are kind of fixed, and now you have a new entity that is paying into those costs, and so potentially you end up redistributing costs among more taxpayers, and rates can actually go down. This has happened in North Dakota, which saw a huge increase in electricity demand driven by data centers in the early 2020s, and yet at the same time falling electricity prices, or rather a slower electricity price growth than other parts of the country.
Eric, you have acknowledged in your piece that towns can get caught in a race to the bottom, showering tech giants with incentives for projects that the think tank Brookings Institute says would have come anyway. If communities are routinely overpaying for these types of data centers, why should an ordinary town believe it'll strike a good deal rather than potentially get fleeced by one of these giant companies?
Yeah, so I think that, to be clear, what usually happens in these situations is the reason why the localities are giving the tax subsidy is because they're going to end up with more revenue even with that break than they would if the data center didn't locate in their area. That, basically, even if you, give back 20% of the revenue generated by a new data center, that data center is still going to get you more revenue than if you have land that's just sitting idle, or is going to end up going to a user that doesn't pay, have as much taxable property as a data center does. And so even when towns are kind of getting cheated a little bit, they're ending up with more revenue than they otherwise would have. It's not like you're taking money away from the public schools to give to OpenAI. That said, the Brookings research suggests that towns are often mistaken about the need to give this kind of incentive to the data center in order to get it to locate there.
Sure.
That AI companies right now are so ravenous for new data centers that if your town has the physical stuff that they're looking for, the right fiber optic connections, the right, construction laborers or prices, chances are they're going to want to do a project in your area, whether you give them an incentive in terms of a tax rebate or not. And so in many cases, perhaps not all, municipalities can be driving a harder bargain and getting even more revenue out of these companies.
Well, there is so much more to talk about here and so much more to dig into specifically locally here in New York and in New Jersey, where these data centers are very much a concern of local residents and of local lawmakers. Eric Levitz is a senior correspondent at Vox. Eric, thanks so much for coming on today and for explaining some of this to us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.